National Broadcasting Company, in cooperation with the Educational Television and Radio Center, presents the subject is jazz. With Gilbert Seldes. His program, Swing. With our guest, Mr. John Hammond. And now, our host, critic, and chronicler of the lively arts, Gilbert Seldes.
Once in a while, when you're listening to people talk about jazz, you feel as if you're Alice in Wonderland and had gone through the looking glass. There's a time when the White Knight said to Alice that he was going to sing her song, and the name of the song is called Haddock's Eyes. And Alice said, "Oh, that's the name of the song, is it?" The White Knight said, "No, that was just what the name was called. The name really was something else entirely." Because now we come to a time in the story of jazz that's universally known as the age of swing. But swing is only what it's called, you know. It really is jazz. So why is it called swing? To make it easier for ourselves, suppose we just say swing is a name given to a certain way of playing jazz between the years 1935 and 45, roughly. We know that in swing, the accent switches from two-bar phrases like this to four-bar phrases. The harmony also changes from three parts to four or five. And the basic beat changes from two beats to four. Now, putting them all together, what did the music of the time really sound like? Well, if it were arranged by Cy Oliver for Jimmy Lunsford, it would have these qualities. It would still retain some of the two-beat feeling of early jazz. There'd be a unique type of phrasing for the saxes and high brass figures, as you'll see in For Dancers Only. many of the musicians you've just heard playing for dancers only used to play in swing bands in the past. Usually there were between 13 and 17 men in a swing orchestra. And some were bigger, and bigness at times presented quite a problem. Because this problem, which had to do with the number of people in the band, was solved by the arrival of a new figure on the scene of jazz. He had indeed existed before in a small way. The big band made him indispensable. He was the arranger. Now, the arranger organized the material that was used, and then working with the band leader, he virtually determined the style in which the band played. Provided backgrounds for soloists and their improvisations. He used sections, like the reeds and the brass, with one another and against one another. And he harmonized soloists. This is what a lead sheet of an arranger's work looks like. Now, our guest today is neither a band leader nor an arranger, and yet he has been called the key man in the swing era. Chemistry had called him a catalytic agent. Because of him, the combination of band and arranger reacted and created something different. His name is John Hammond. The music you're hearing is called John's Idea, and is a tribute to him by one of the great men of swing, Count Basie. You call it, John?
I certainly do, but you know, the original title of that was I May Be Wrong, It's John's Idea.
This takes you back to the time it was probably composed. Now, will you go back and tell us what must be the central episode in the creation of swing when you brought Fletcher Henderson and Benny Goodman together?
Well, Gilbert, I had always thought that Fletcher had the freest and the most imaginative of all the large bands of that era. You know, Fletcher Henderson, for years, was the alternate band at Roseland Ballroom. And as a leader, he was the one man who made full use of all the improvising soloists that he had in the band. And his arrangements left great gaps so that such stars as Coleman Hawkins, Benny Morton, Joe Smith, at one
Benny
time...
Morton is with our band now, isn't
he certainly is, and at one time even Louis Armstrong was in that band. In 1934, when Benny Goodman found himself right in this very studio in the NBC Let's Dance program, with a budget that provided for 8 arrangements a week, it was kind of providential that he and Fletcher got together. And I guess it was...
You brought them together.
Well, maybe, if you want to say,
yes,
say that. All right. And then it was my role kind of to persuade both Benny and Fletcher that what they should do with the pop tunes of the day is to swing them. In other words, to let the individual soloist play just as freely as he would in an old New Orleans or a standard number.
That meant getting away from what the publishers put down on the sheet music.
Exactly, and of course they had to fight the publishers to do this. But after some disappointments, the band finally clicked, and I guess you could say that the swing era was on its way.
Yes, it was indeed, and one of the things that I know that Fletcher Henderson did, as you know it too, is that in addition to arranging pop tunes, he also made new arrangements of New Orleans jazz. And this is what we're going to have played now, a Fletcher Henderson arrangement of the King Porter Stomp. Now, in it, as I know, one of the major characteristics of all of his style, if we're going to hear, and that's the use of the brass and the saxes as if they were echoing each other in the choirs. That will come at the end of the final choruses of King Porter Stomp. Anyone who read the papers in those days was aware of swing. Anyone went to the college was aware that it was the big thing on the college campuses. And the big movie palaces presented swing bands, and young people, and some who were not so young, used to dance in the aisles and used to fling themselves sometimes on the musicians on the stage. Well, the country had come out of certainly the acute phases of the Depression. There's a good deal of dancing going on everywhere. And the buoyancy of swing, its air of general freedom, it suited the style of dancing that came in after the Charleston, Black Bottom, that sort of thing. But 10 years before swing began, a subtle change was taking place in jazz itself, or rather what people thought was jazz. What most people heard between 1925 and 30 didn't really have the basic characteristics of jazz. The hot was being overshadowed by sweet music. It was as if jazz was being led by some people into the genteel tradition, and they talked about symphonic jazz. And yet, jazz did keep going, and the real question is, John Hammond, where was it preserved?
Well, it certainly wasn't preserved on radio, because radio just avoided creative jazz the way television did until
John,
1957.
1957, good enough.
Yeah, right. But the phonograph record was really the only receptacle for good jazz performances. By 1933, though, the phonograph was nearly extinct. It was a victim of a couple of twin enemies, the Depression and radio.
Bad enough.
Yeah, but except for the bands of Duke Ellington, Jimmy Lunsford, Louis Armstrong, Chick Webb, maybe a handful of others, I guess there just wasn't any jazz as we know it today. More than that, the good soloists had kind of lost confidence in themselves. Some of them had tried to make it, you know, as jazz artists, and found there wasn't room for them anywhere.
Seems hard to believe, really.
It certainly does, and slick outfits like Mal Hallett and the Glenn Gray Casa Band kind of palmed off something that they called jazz, and really the public was none the wiser.
John, it's clear you don't like these last name
I'm
bands.
afraid I didn't too much.
Get on to people you like.
With the success of Goodman and the Dorsey Brothers bands, though, competition grew in the jazz field. Young listeners became aware that the musicians had actual names. They just weren't nameless sidemen as they had been in the past. And by 1937, I think you saw people like Harry James, Artie Shaw, Bunny Berrigan, Jack Teagarden, and a host of others who left the berth that they had in the big bands and struck out for themselves. You know, until Goodman's arrival on the scene, Gilbert, there was a absolute straight color line in jazz, rigid as it could be.
Yeah, I see it was.
And Benny broke it first with Teddy Wilson and the trio, and then by the addition of Lionel Hampton and the quartet, and finally by the inclusion of both Negroes in the big band and in the sextet. Other leaders followed until today. Mixed bands are no longer too unusual a sight. Then there were small combos like Bob Crosby's Bobcats and the Dorsey Clambake Seven, and the various Goodman groups which kept alive the tradition of freewheeling improvisation.
Well, 7 seems to be a sort of sacred number for the combo within the swing band, and that is what we have arranged because we want to take a small group from the big band to illustrate the flexibility and the possibilities for individual creation that you can have in such a group. We're going to play Flying Home.
Let's hear it.
John, swing is the time you came into jazz, about the time that I went out. I couldn't believe that it ever was going to decline, and I still don't know why it did.
Well, of course, people are still swinging today, but the decline of the kind of the swing bands that we're talking about came about, I think, both because of the draft, which robbed the bands of the leaders and the sidemen both.
And you.
And me, too. That's right. And then, of course, also that 20% tax, which is still deviling us, which is put on all admissions and checks in any place where there's dancing.
Yeah, this is you as an economist, but were there artistic reasons as well?
Well, I think so, too. I think the rhythmic and harmonic experimentation that went on in the bebop and progressive jazz era kind of halted America's dancing feet.
Well, we're going to come to those in later programs. You can be
All
sure.
right. But one thing you can say about rock and roll, that even though it has a different beat, and it's not really like the jazz we're hearing today, it's gotten America's kids dancing again. And I think that a lot of the kids who go in for rock and roll first come right back to jazz afterwards.
John, it's fantastic. It's refreshing to hear the name of rock and roll mentioned without universal condemnation. Now, I know that you are connected with two great bands, Basie's and Benny Goodman's. Can you briefly tell us the difference between them, the characteristics?
Yes, I think Benny's whole idea was for precision, for order, whereas Basie had a kind of a loose feeling of improvisation that just made his band absolutely unique before and since, because even Basie's band today doesn't have that looseness and freedom.
Now, we're going to play an arrangement made by Buck Clayton for our band here. Buck Clayton was the man you just heard playing the first trumpet, wasn't it?
He was just playing the solo trumpet and flying home.
And flying home. And this is the 1 o'clock jump. In every art form, you find what the biologists call mutations. And as in biology, some of these mutations lead nowhere, and some of them contribute to the growth of the whole organism. Swing is one of the vital strains of jazz. One reason can be found in the words of a Catholic philosopher, Father Kennard of Loyola University in Los Angeles. He says, where jazz cannot make swing, it drops. And then he says, the jazz that does swing, it responds to a void in modern man. It's lonely, cynical, and weary. To such modern man, jazz represents a counter-image, restoring to him the maker of myths and the dreamer of dreams. Today's program, we're grateful to Cy Oliver and Benny Goodman for the use of the arrangements, John Hammond for coming with us. On the past programs, we've studied improvisation, ragtime, early jazz. In our next program, we'll discuss the blues and other basic ingredients, all of jazz.
Is presented in cooperation with the Educational Television and Radio Center. This is an NBC television production. This is National Educational Television.